everybody. Thanks a lot, Kyle, for the reading. I was also just informed that there are these, pamphlets of devotionals that are available in the back that are, free to grab for anybody who wants them. Is that correct? So feel free to grab some. I'm going to hold on to this one and appreciate the offer. So today, as Kyle just read in 1 Kings chapter 12, we're going to be talking about the story of the unwise king Rehoboam, with a specific focus on the topic of counseling. Okay, so it's almost a segue into the topic of counseling, which I'll be zooming in and spending most of my attention on. So just to give a bit of setting to this story, King Rehoboam was the fourth king of Israel. So the first king was King Saul, followed by King David, followed by King Solomon, and then Rehoboam was the son of King Solomon. And he had just passed away, King Solomon had, making way for King Rehoboam to basically inherit this throne and become the next king of Israel. And I'll talk a bit about the reign of King Solomon, because it was during the reign of King Solomon where Israel really reached its peak in terms of its economic fruitfulness, as well as its military fruitfulness as well. It reads in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 24, "For he was ruling over everything west of the Euphrates River, from Tifsah even to Gaza, over all the kings west of the river. And this was because of the work of his father David before him, that he had peace on all areas around him as well." So Solomon essentially had managed to retain the peace that had been established by King David, and he developed such a military and economic powerhouse and prosperity because of the wise and discerning heart that he had been miraculously blessed with by God himself. It reads in 1 Kings, or rather, it was this wisdom that he received was ascribed in 1 Kings chapter 3, because Solomon essentially was humble and had a big task ahead of him when he inherited the throne, and he asked God for wisdom. He asked for an understanding heart to judge and the ability to discern between good and evil, to which God provided. And it was because of this spiritual submission to God that God also promised to give Solomon such prosperity, and more so than all the kings of his age. And it's also described during this reign, through the passage that we read today, that during the reign of King Solomon, he had made the yoke hard and the labor heavy on the nation. So in order to achieve this economic and this military prosperity, a lot was required of the nation of Israel, a lot of subjugating to the king. In 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 22 and on, it describes a bit of what Solomon had in terms of the abundance. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened geese. So Judah and Israel lived securely, everyone under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and those deputies provided food for King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table. Each in his month they allowed nothing to be lacking. They also brought barley and straw for the war horses and baggage horses to the place where it was required, each deputy according to his duty. So there was abundance in all areas, and Solomon required a lot for his government. He required a lot of the people for his government. And the prophet Samuel had actually warned against this, that when the nation of Israel said they desired a king, he told them that they would be subjugated to a king had they decided to have a king be their leader. And we can kind of see that during the reign of King Solomon. Not that they were oppressed or anything, but that a lot was required of them, specifically in the form of labor and in taxes. This is what the hard yoke and the heavy labor is describing. So it was during this time that Solomon built the temple and his palace, which used only the finest materials. He built the wall around Jerusalem. He rebuilt towns and cities that had been damaged and destroyed. He built a fleet of ships. And the work and the cost necessary in order to achieve this, as I mentioned, required high taxation, heavy labor from the Israelites. And during the reign of King Solomon, they were all too willing to do this. Solomon had an amazing reputation. He was wise. And they could also see the fruits of their labor creating this gigantic prosperity for Israel. So the efforts and the sacrifices that they were making were contributing to something great. And it could be seen through the growth of this kingdom. And by the time King Solomon had passed away, this long and arduous journey to achieve these things had been achieved, and this is essentially the time point when we enter King Rehoboam. All right, and now we're talking about the King Rehoboam story, as Kyle graciously read for us. So almost immediately after becoming king, King Rehoboam was summoned to Shechem, which is sort of the geographical center of the northern tribes of Israel. And he was pleaded with. He was pleaded with by the Israelites. It reads in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4, "Your father made our yoke hard, but now lighten the hard labor imposed by your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you." So the Israelites had been taxed so severely. They had worked so hard physically. Over the whole course of Solomon's reign, Israel had become rich. The glory and honor that the kingdom of Israel had been brought to had been established, and now it was time for the Israelites to partake of all of this abundance that had been accumulated because of the efforts that they had put forth. And in light of this, they asked King Rehoboam to lighten this yoke, to reduce their taxes, to reduce the labor, to in essence extend grace to them for having had been faithful to the king. And in so doing so, they said they would serve King Rehoboam. And this branches me into the topic that I want to focus on today, which is the topic of counseling. Because, before I get to the because, I just want to quickly define counseling in very broad terms. I'm going to come back to this definition later on when I start to kind of break it apart. But it's essentially a conversation where one party with questions, problems, and troubles seeks assistance from someone that they believe has answers, solutions, and help. Okay, so it's seeking advice. You have some issue, you're seeking some kind of advice to help you in the resolution of that issue, whatever it may be. And after receiving this request from the Israelites, King Rehoboam was wise in that he didn't rashly come to a conclusion in that moment. He actually did seek counsel. And it reads in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice." So he did seek counsel, and he approached two very different groups of people in his search for this counsel, and he received two very different forms of counsel from these two groups of people. The first group were elders. They were elders who had served Solomon. They had been appointed to that position of counselor through the wisdom of Solomon. They had advised the king, Solomon, who had been more successful at being a king in Israel in terms of economy and military than any other king that Israel had had at that point or would have. He was the most exceptional king of his days, as described. And he got counseling from the same counselors who counseled King Solomon. The second group of counsel he received was from his like-minded buddies, his peers, his friends, young people, probably with a lot of aspiration but not a lot of wisdom. Okay, those are pretty much the two groups of people that he received advice from. And Solomon, when he had become king, through the grace of God, he realized his shortcomings. He realized he was young. He realized he had a large task ahead of him. He had some kind of sense of self-awareness. And within this self-awareness, he humbly asked God for the wisdom that he would eventually receive in order to lead that kingdom to the places that he led it, which was into greatness. But Rehoboam, as you can see, lacked this self-awareness that Solomon had. Because rather than heed the advice of the elders and in love and compassion essentially extend grace to the nation of Israel and have them serve him throughout his entire kingship, which would be the wise path, Rehoboam instead followed the foolish path. He exercised his prideful ambitions in an attempt to subjugate the people further in the interest of his own glory and his own elevation. Okay, this was the decision that Rehoboam made based on the counseling that he received. So he was wise in that he sought counsel, but he was foolish in the type of counseling that he chose to heed. And as a result, Israel would become divided. You'd have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and it would never be reunited. And the kingdom would essentially only go downhill from there. And this, in a lot of ways, was the catalyst to the eventual disassembling of the entire nation of Israel entirely. Okay, from this one moment, all because of accepting bad counsel. Okay, hence the emphasis on the topic of counseling, because clearly it's something that we should consider and be wary of. And there's two things that we could learn here: that we're wise to seek counsel, but not all counsel is good counsel. Okay, so I'm going to really hammer the point home first for the being wise to seek counsel. There's many proverbs that discuss this. I'm going to mention a few. So I read already Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15, but there's also Proverbs chapter 13, verse 10. Through overconfidence comes nothing but strife, but wisdom is with those who receive counsel. Proverbs chapter 15, verse 22. Without consultation, plans are frustrated, but with many counselors they succeed. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 14. Where there is no guidance, the people fall, but in an abundance of counselors there is victory. No, I'm joking. I'm going to stop there. So a wise man seeks counsel. Counsel is the path to victory and success. It can only be received through humility, and the opposite is true. Foolish people do not seek counsel, and it will only lead them into failure in some sense. And even Solomon, who was blessed with divine wisdom, sought counsel. So even though there were no issues in terms of his judgment, his ability to discern between good and evil, he still realized that because of the corruption of his flesh, he would be wise to seek counsel from impartial people in order to make wise decisions. And in fact, it was Solomon who wrote the Proverbs that I just described. Okay, so Solomon, the wisest man in the history of earth, so wise that he could come up with the best answer to any solution, to any problem that arose, still sought counseling. All right, counseling, very important. We are wise to seek it. And we also see other practical instances in the Bible in which counsel took place and led to a fruitful result. There's Moses and his father-in-law Jethro, described in Exodus chapter 18, where pretty much Moses had been judging. He was judging and addressing all of the troubles and the issues that were arising amongst the multitude of Israelites. And it says that he was judging from morning until night, very, very busy, on the verge of burning out, according to his father-in-law Jethro, who wisely gave him some advice. He said that what Moses should do is that he should choose men, he should appoint men who fear God, who speak the truth, to be judges of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens, to carry this burden along with Moses. Moses had a problem, Jethro had a solution to that problem, and it profited Moses and the nation of Israel, because if Moses burnt out, there would have been larger issues for the nation as a whole. Another example is Nathan counseling Bathsheba right before Solomon was about to be coronated into becoming the king. So this is described in 1 Kings chapter 1. So King David was old, and his son, and I have a hard time pronouncing this, but Adonijah, he attempted to basically perform a coup and steal the throne from King Solomon before the coronation happened. So Nathan, who was wise and who was noticing this about to take place, approached Bathsheba and counseled that they should essentially rush that coronation process in order for Solomon to truly become the king. And they heeded this advice, and Solomon became king for it. So that was a profitable end result. Nathan, being a man who feared God and spoke the truth, gave helpful advice for people who needed that advice, that counsel. So in both of these cases, people had issues, they had problems, and they received counseling, and they heeded that counseling, and they were better off for heeding that counseling, because we are wise to seek counsel. That is just a biblical reality. It's also just kind of inherently obvious that not all counseling is good counseling. So we should be mindful of the type of counseling we receive. We can see that exact example in the story that Kyle read today, about the unwise King Rehoboam, who heeded bad counseling. He received good counseling, he received bad counseling, he rejected the good counseling in favor of the bad counseling. So we have to be mindful of what qualities should we be looking for in a counselor that we could trust, that will actually give us advice that will lead us down a path that is good. So the first point I want to mention is that we are described as being wise, or rather it is wise to seek counsel. So I just want to talk a little bit about wisdom, which is described in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, that the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. And the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, and true knowledge is knowledge of the Lord. Therefore, fearing God and seeking the truth, capital T, is the recipe for wisdom. And in our wisdom, we should be seeking counsel, obviously, from people who themselves are wise. So we're wise to seek counsel. We should exercise wisdom as well when accepting advice. And the people that we receive wisdom from should themselves fear the Lord and have knowledge relevant to the issue that it is that we're dealing with. So I want to take a little bit of a sidestep and kind of think, okay, well, does this need to apply to every single instance of counseling we receive in our lives? Do we always need to approach people who are wise, as in have fear of the Lord? Do they always need to be filled with the knowledge of the Lord in order for us to be willing to accept counsel or advice from them? And I would say no, because not all counseling is spiritual in nature. Okay, and I'll explain this. So if I go back to that general definition, so counseling is a conversation where one party with questions, problems, or troubles seeks assistance from someone they believe has answers, solutions, and help. So we can see that the definition of counseling is actually very broad. It doesn't just pertain to spiritual things, but it can pertain to mundane things as well, because anytime anybody gives you advice or you heed advice from anybody about anything, technically you're receiving counseling from them. You've probably been asked questions and given advice and not even realized that you were giving counseling to people, because counseling takes place all the time, and it is not necessarily spiritual in nature. So for example, there's coaching, speech therapy, job training. You can go see a banker, a subject teacher, whatever it may be, and you can get advice from these people that is not necessarily spiritual in nature. So for example, if I'm looking for advice on how to consolidate my debt, it would make sense for me to go see a banker who has knowledge of the different companies that might be willing to consolidate this debt, the different interest rates, these sorts of things, in order to receive the advice that I need in order to make a decision on that, very mundane, non-spiritual issue. When I say non-spiritual, I mean it has nothing to do with worldview, has nothing to do with judgments about good or bad, these sorts of things. Or myself, I'm a teacher, so if I have a student who has questions about the curriculum that I teach, maybe they want advice on how they should study to approach a test, what assignments they should complete in order to maximize their grades. Well, I could give them advice that really exists within the specific bubble of that mundane thing that I'm dealing with, right? So I can provide counseling, and it would not be spiritual counseling. And in the same way, they wouldn't necessarily need to go approach some kind of an elder or a wise man who knows the scriptures in order to get answers to those questions. Okay? So that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get across here. Now, let's say instead of going to see a banker about consolidating my debt, let's say I wanted advice on how I should spend my money. Well, that becomes a much more spiritual question, because there's lots of decisions that I need to make that'll affect the way that I live my life. So therefore, the way that I spend my money would kind of divert more into a spiritual type of question that I'd be looking for a solution to. Or instead of, I'm already in a subject trying to learn the best way to study for it, what if I was asking, well, what subjects should I study and what career should I pursue? Well, that would have more to do with larger questions that relate to how I'm going to live my life. So that would sort of exit that mundane realm and enter a more spiritual realm of, what sort of decisions I should make about the way that I live my life. Okay, so I'm just trying to draw this distinction between mundane types of situations and spiritual types of situations. Mundane meaning that there's no real issue of like what is right or what is wrong or world views or moral judgments or how you live your life. Whereas in spiritual issues, well, those issues arise, and therefore the type of counseling we should receive is different. And the type of counseling that is described biblically relates to these types of spiritual questions. All right? So if we go back to the type of examples that I talked about, the Rehoboam example, well, he was seeking answers to the types of broader decisions that he should make, and how that would affect other people in a larger spectrum of situation based on what is good and bad and right and wrong. That was a spiritual question that he had. Same thing with the Jethro's Moses example. How are you going to lead this nation? Are you going to lead it as one man judging everybody, or are you going to appoint people to help you carry that burden? This is a larger question about how you're going to lead. What is the right choice to make as it affects yourself and other people in a spiritual sense? And when we are talking about the biblical example and the Proverbs that I read, it's always making a separation in those verses between wisdom and foolishness. So what I mean is, in those Proverbs that I read, the title, because those titles are sort of falsely inserted, all of those sections I read are kind of drawing distinctions between the wise man and the foolish man. And then it says the wise man should seek counsel, etc., through the verses that I read. And since we know that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, it is discussing issues of how we should live our lives. And in this sort of setting, we are very much dealing with spiritual types of contexts. And in these spiritual types of contexts, we are wise to seek counsel, and the type of counsel that we should receive should be from people who themselves are spiritually connected to God. So as Christians, if we have questions, problems, or troubles that relate to spiritual things that relate to things like worldviews, how we live our lives, then we should seek assistance from someone who we believe has the correct spiritual answers, the correct spiritual solutions, and the correct spiritual help for those problems. And I'll go into this a little bit more. So Paul describes this, sort of as like a side point in Romans chapter 15, verse 14. It reads, "And concerning you, my brothers and sisters, I myself am convinced that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able also to admonish one another." And he goes on, but I just want to zoom in that as Paul is describing approval of these Christians in Rome, he describes certain traits that these spiritually stable Christians possess. He describes them as being full of goodness, he describes them as being filled with all knowledge, and he describes them as being able to instruct. Well, full of goodness, that means that they understand good and evil, they understand right and wrong through the works of the Spirit, they are spiritually mature, and they are friends in the sense that they actually seek what is best for each other in each other's best interest. Okay, so they are full of goodness. They're also filled with all knowledge. They've studied the Word of God. They continue to study the Word of God in humility, constantly trying to learn. They have this wisdom. They have this fear of the Lord. They are well versed in biblical truth. They have an understanding of theology, etc. They are knowledgeable in the things of God. And they are able to instruct. They walk in the Spirit, and they are willing to approach people and possibly scold them if they are not conducting themselves in a way that is aligning with the Scriptures, with the walk of Jesus Christ himself. So these are just commendable qualities which make them good examples emulating Jesus Christ himself. Being full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct. And if we're having spiritual struggles in our lives, we would be wise to seek advice from mature Christians like those who possess these qualities, who are wise, who fear the Lord, who know what the truth is, and who speak the truth in our best interests. So these are the types of counselors that we should be seeking when it comes to questions that are spiritual in nature. I don't need to talk to this person if I'm trying to get advice on my loan consolidation, but when it comes to these larger questions of how I live my life, this would be the type of wise counselor that I should be approaching. And through this filter, we can actually see the exact issue that arose in the Rehoboam story. Because he was actually very fortunate, because he did receive wise counsel. He received foolish counsel too, and he foolishly accepted that foolish counsel, but he received wise counsel. He was instructed by men who were full of goodness. They had counseled the wisest king in history. They were themselves presumably wise. They had good intentions for Rehoboam and the united nation of Israel. They had good intentions. They were full of goodness. They were filled with knowledge. They understood the context. They understood the scriptures. They presumably feared the Lord. They had information that they could share that would be helpful to Rehoboam's situation. And they were obviously able to instruct because they were counselors by profession. Okay? But In 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 8, it reads that Rehoboam ignored this counsel. He just outright ignored it. He had counsel from people who fit all of the criteria for being a good counselor for spiritual things, and he rejected them. And why did he reject it? Well, it came as a result of his own lack of wisdom, his own lack of having a fear of the Lord. He considered God's wisdom to be foolishness, so instead of accepting God's wisdom as it was presented to him, he rather chose to go advice shopping, which basically means that he went looking to talk to people who would tell him the types of things that he wanted to hear. That's basically what it came down to. And he found exactly those people. He found like-minded people, men who weren't full of goodness. They did not know, presumably, what was spiritually good and what was spiritually evil. They didn't know what was good for him, or if they did, they didn't present any kind of desire to do what was good for Rehoboam. They weren't filled with knowledge. They didn't understand the context enough to be advising him on the complexities of this political situation. They obviously didn't know enough of the things of God to have given him any kind of sound advice. And they were not able to instruct or admonish or scold because they were a bunch of yes men. They basically told Rehoboam what he wanted to hear in order to make him feel good about himself, even though it led him down a road that resulted in harm for him and harm for his kingdom. And this is what we call affirmation. They affirmed him. They told him the things he wanted to hear. And affirmation is terrible counseling. If you're telling someone what they want to hear just for the sake of telling them what they want to hear, that is terrible counseling. And it is specifically unloving because you're giving them advice that is leading them down a dark road. And I'm just going to give an example. So this is an example from my work. And I'm not going to say the real person's name because this is getting recorded and who knows. Okay, so there's a coworker of mine, her name is Sally, and she's a bit of a popular teacher, mostly popular because, she's very agreeable when it comes to, the students, and she takes the students' sides on things, and they like her. And I had a few students approach me once, and they said, Chris, we like you, but Sally, she's the goat, okay, which means greatest of all time. And I told them that, that's fine, I'd rather be more like a lamb, so it was okay. I thought it was a good comeback. So anyway, just to say one story. So there were a few, but there was one girl. Her name was Melissa, her pretend name. And she had multiple issues in her own home life and her social life and these sorts of things. She was being fostered. A sad story in many ways. There was substance abuse, there was promiscuity, there were issues in her life, no doubt. And she would go see Sally because, like I said, Sally was very affirming, and she kind of told her things she wanted to hear, and it made her feel good about herself, so she'd constantly go back to see Sally. And I remember at one point, she went to go see Sally for advice because she had just had a confrontation with another teacher who she more or less, swore at and was angry at because this teacher had given her a 0 on an assignment that she didn't do, and she was mad at her for it. All right, and we could obviously all empathize that, this girl was going through stuff, so we can definitely understand the context. But what Sally told her in terms of advice was more or less that, she was fully within her rights and kind of screw that teacher. That was basically the advice that she gave to Melissa regarding her treatment of this teacher. And this was bad advice. This was affirmation, right? A good advice would be to sympathize, to explain that you understand their situation, but then to, helpfully try to get them to understand, the context of the situation. Why did they get 0 on that assignment? Is it this teacher's fault? Was the teacher being mean to you? Did she wrong you? What are better ways to approach the situation to get a more fruitful outcome in the future? This type of advice out of love in the interest of bettering their situation. But rather, as I said, she affirmed her. And there were a few different situations that happened throughout the year. I'm not sure if she was being counseled by Sally during these particular instances, but fundamentally this girl ended up getting expelled from school for similar issues. So just swearing at teachers, not doing her work, getting upset, and she got expelled. So it led down a road where she ended up suffering consequences. And I believe in large part it was because of this bad counseling, this affirmation that she had received from a teacher who just told her what she wanted to hear instead of actually caring enough about her to maybe tell her things that she didn't want to hear but out of love. And another example of affirmation being a bad form of counseling is sort of like an issue that we're having in our society today, which relates to trans youth and this affirmation counseling. It's specifically called gender affirmation care. It's described in the World Health Organization as encompassing a range of social, behavioral, psychological, and medical interventions designed to support and affirm an individual's gender identity when it conflicts with the gender they were assigned at birth. Okay, so that's like the World Health Organization definition of this form of counseling. So rather than help these individuals, who are struggling, who are suffering in many ways, accept the biological reality of their situation in a loving way, they encourage counselors to instead disregard objective truth entirely in favor of subjective falsehoods. And this has led to many issues, right? This almost pandemic-like issue that we see today with the eventual hormone therapy, the surgeries, and all these sorts of things that cause physical harm, emotional and psychological harm, and even reduce the lifespans of these people, all because of this affirmation, because affirmation is just bad counseling. Telling people what they want to hear for the sake of making them feel good is bad advice. And I realize it's ironic that being full of goodness is often in contention with making people feel good about themselves, but it's just the reality of the situation. Because people often do destructive things, they do harmful things. They need a loving person who's willing to counsel them against these things to hopefully lead them to improvements in their life. In fact, it's specifically unloving not to do that. So thus, as Christians, the story of Rehoboam provides us a very sound message of the importance of seeking counsel and being discerning about the type of counseling that we're receiving. Because what makes us feel good is not necessarily what is good for us. And this brings me to a topic which might be controversial. I'm not sure if it is. But it's a topic of psychotherapy. So whether or not psychotherapy, for example, is something that we as Christians should be pursuing. So in other words, should Christians pursue secular counseling to deal with the issues that they have, the mental illnesses they have, the struggles that they have? And this is the type of thing I want to zoom in on. Because typically when we think of the word counseling, this is what we're thinking of. I went to counseling, you're thinking you went to go see a psychiatrist, a therapist, a psychologist, someone who has some kind of professional degree to help people with these sorts of mental battles and struggles that they're going through. And I feel like this would be an incomplete sermon if I did not talk about that. So before I discuss whether or not this type of counseling is something that we should pursue as Christians, I want to talk about some of the positives, because there certainly are positives that have come out of psychological research. So we've learned a lot about emotions, we've learned a lot about behavior, what triggers behavior, we learned a lot about thoughts, how people think, why they think the way that they think. We learned about how humans process information. We have learned a lot about how to help people explore their thoughts, to take control of their thoughts. And just generally helping them better to learn, interpret events, make decisions. And just to give a real-life example of myself, so my bachelor's degree was in the field of neuroscience, which technically is a psychology degree, and it's been a long, long time since I studied it, so don't ask me any questions pertaining to my degree. I don't consider myself to be a psychologist. But I remember that when I was doing my studies, I had a cognitive psychology course. And in this cognitive psychology course, I learned about all these different methods that had been filtered through psychological research to help you learn and help improve your memory and all these sorts of things, and different approaches that you can take to help you study. And I remember learning those approaches and then applying one specific one that was deemed to be full of efficacy. I forget the exact terminology. And it helped me be a better student in my other classes. I learned things better because I was applying these methodologies, because these studies help people, these forms of psychological research help us better understand the human mind and things like how we learn, and we could filter through this information and find valuable stuff that can help us in our daily life. So these are positives, and there's other good evidence-based practices that had demonstrated efficacy in an objective way as well. Okay, so lots of good things, and even psychotherapy. Okay, it has helped many people cope with or overcome mental illness. Okay, so I'm not bashing it. There's people with depression, anxiety, eating disorders, substance abuse problems, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, all these other issues who have overcome or managed to, get a hold on these issues enough to allow them to be functional in society, happier in society, all these other things. Okay, so I'm not bashing psychotherapy. There are lots of positive things that have come out of it, as well as psychological research in general. And I'm actually a fan of certain techniques that are employed in psychotherapy sessions. Because people can learn to better understand their history, their triggers, better develop a sense of self-awareness by talking to someone who is seemingly objective to help them learn about themselves and why it is that they react the way that they do to things. And it could also help people to take control of their thinking, which is actually a biblical principle. In Christians, we're actually encouraged in a very large part to control our own thinking and to direct it towards God. I have a few verses here. 2 Corinthians verse 10, part of verse 5, when arguing how to battle against our carnality, Paul states that we are taking every thought captive to obedience to the Lord, right? So we should be controlling our thoughts. Corinthians chapter 3, verse 2, set your minds on the things that are above, not on the things that are on the earth. So control your thoughts. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13, prepare your minds for action, keep sober in spirit, set your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ, which illustrate how as Christians we are called to take control of our way of thinking. All right, we shouldn't just let our thoughts wander in every direction that they may wander. We should take control of our thoughts and direct them towards Christ. Okay, so these are good things, learning how to take control of our thoughts. And there are other such methods that people go through in psychotherapy practices that are good as well, like learning how to empathize with people and these sorts of things. For the topic of taking control of our thoughts, the issue with psychotherapy becomes, well, what direction do you point them after you have taken control of these thoughts? And this is the area where we should be discerning when we are going through psychotherapy sessions. Apply these techniques, learn things about yourself, learn to take control of your thoughts, but to where? Well, that is where in a psychotherapy session, these more pragmatic, functional aspects deviate a little bit, and the psychotherapist is forced to insert worldviews and opinions in order to determine how to direct your thoughts. And I'm going to go through a couple case study examples. So I was watching through a video series by Heath Lambert. He's a biblical counselor, and he described these two examples as well. One is, obviously an example of bad counseling. The other one, I would say not so obvious, and I want to just read these, talk about them, and see what we can learn. So the first example he describes in this video series is from a man named Peter Kramer, who is a Harvard-trained therapist and an author. He wrote a book called Moments of Engagement, and he describes in this book an instant of his counseling. Excuse me. And in this instance of counseling, he describes a couple. He was only counseling the woman. The woman's name was was Wendy, and she went to counseling regarding her relationship issues with her husband, Rick, who seemed not to be interested in her anymore. Okay, so she seemed to want to, repair this marriage. He seemed disinterested in her. And it was even worse than that. He was actually storing up money through illegal sales that he was making, and he'd put this money into a separate bank account, and then every year he would take off to Vegas and spend all of this money and then come back and not tell her what he was doing all that time. Okay, so it was a bad situation. Okay, so not only was he seemingly not interested in her anymore, he was also partaking of very sinful practices with regard to the marriage. So getting money illegally and then spending that money in mystery ways in Vegas, of all places. The sin capital, as it's described. So Kramer gave a suggestion, and his suggestion was more or less that Mary should do the same thing. Okay, that was his recommendation. And I'm gonna read the quote, but he basically said that she should dress sexy, flirt, spend a lot of money, and see if he becomes interested again. This was like the counseling advice that he gave her. So I'll read, as I mentioned, a paragraph from his book. It says, most of the cure lay in our one crafted instruction, go to Vegas and lose money. If anything, our intervention was too effective. Wendy flourished so dramatically that I began to fear for the marriage. Over a year after treatment stopped, Rick called me complaining that Wendy wanted to leave him. He sounded paranoid and clinically depressed. He was now even more involved with drugs than in the past. He showed up once or twice, but never really turned into a patient, and my last impression of the couple was that they were about to divorce. And he drew a conclusion from this. He wrote, whether this outcome is desirable in a couple's treatment of this sort is hard to say. In individual therapy, we congratulate ourselves when a masochistic wife manages to leave a neglectful husband. In family therapy, we tend more to wonder whether the marriage couldn't have worked at all. Okay, and this was his synopsis of this case study example of the advice that he gave Wendy regarding her husband, Rick. So basically, he gave advice that resulted in Wendy, quote unquote, flourishing and on the road to likely leave her hedonistic husband, who, after she counseled with him, was on the road to developing mental illness of his own. To which Kramer concludes that it's hard to say whether or not this counseling was effective or not. And I think even though Kramer has a difficult time concluding if this counseling was good or not, I think as Christians, it's pretty obvious to conclude that this is an example of bad counseling, right? There's a few examples for this. First of all, is that as Christians in general, we would aspire to give advice that would preserve a marriage, improve a marriage, certainly not to just end the marriage, right? Our advice would at least direct in that direction. It might not be perfect, it might not get there, but we would aim for that end result. And we certainly don't believe that the remedy against any kind of problem in our life is to commit sin. Certainly not like equal and opposite sin of the sin that's being done against us, which is what Kramer suggested Mary do. Rather, we'd prefer to help people understand what is good and evil based on God's word, and hopefully help people to overcome the sin that's in their lives. So if we compare this biblical standard that I've talked about, being full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and able to instruct and apply it to Kramer, well, we can see that he fails on all accounts when it comes to this form of counseling. He had no moral compass to decide what was good or bad, and by his own admission, he lacked an objective standard because he said he wasn't even sure if this was good or bad. He also had no knowledge of God's word, no seeming desire to learn anything about God's word and what was actually good or bad, right and wrong. And there's also no indication that Kramer was even potentially willing to condemn bad behavior or provide advice towards some kind of moral good. So first of all, he wouldn't have a moral good to direct towards, and there's no indication that he'd even be willing to, because he was compromised by the counselor-counselee relationship, which was essentially, rooted in money and monetary gain, and his monetary interests would be in conflict with, giving advice that might end the need for counseling, right? It would be in the monetary interest to preserve these types of counselor-counselee relationships for the long term, because then you have more money coming in from these hourly interventions. So, all to say that Kramer's advice had no wisdom, had no understanding, had no obvious path towards doing what was actually good. He gave advice that he thought might be helpful to Wendy, that maybe would help her situation, but instead a struggling woman received advice from a misguided man and ended up traveling down a dark road. All right, so this is an obvious example of bad counseling. And I'm not going to also imply that this is somehow psychotherapy 101, because it isn't. I'm going to talk about a different situation, which is very different and will be a lot more challenging to kind of pilfer through to determine if we should consider it as Christians good counseling or bad counseling. So this second example is described by a psychologist named David Burns. He's a cognitive behavioral therapist, which is considered the gold standard in psychotherapy. And the basic ideology of cognitive behavioral therapy is that they focus on the connection between thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and how they influence each other. And it's David Burns' opinion, as well as the opinion of cognitive behavioral therapists, that negative emotions are the result of improper thinking or unhelpful thinking. And he essentially describes a case in his book called, let me just find it here, Feeling Good. And he describes a situation with a girl named Gail. And I'm just going to read the quote from his book, and then we'll talk about it after. So in this book, he writes, "Start by writing down your automatic thoughts and rational responses for 15 minutes every day for 2 weeks and see the effect this has on your mood. You may be surprised to note the beginning of a period of personal growth and healthy change in your self-image. This was the experience of Gail, a young secretary whose sense of self-esteem was so low that she felt in constant danger of being criticized by friends. She was so sensitive to her roommate's request to help clean up their apartment after a party that she felt rejected and worthless. She was initially so pessimistic about her chances of feeling better that I could barely persuade her to give the triple column technique a try. But when she reluctantly decided to try it, she was surprised to see how her self-esteem and mood began to undergo a rapid transformation. She reported what writing That writing down the negative thoughts that flowed through her mind during the day helped her gain objectivity. She stopped taking these thoughts so seriously. As a result of Gail's daily written exercises, she began to feel better, and her interpersonal relationships improved by a quantum leap. So just to summarize, Gail went to counseling because she had tremendous self-esteem issues to the point that she couldn't tolerate even the mildest of criticisms from people. It would just bring her down. She had very low confidence. And this mostly came as a result of her reacting emotionally rather than rationally to the information that she was receiving, basically. To which Burns concluded that she should essentially reflect on her day, reflect on things through a specific technique called the triple column technique. And I'm not going to go into details, but more or less, as she would have negative thoughts throughout the day, she was encouraged to write them down and then look through a list of, common misconceptions that people make and see if any of those misconceptions applied to her thought process and then to rationalize it. And to do this, as many times during a day as she needed to, more or less. Said 15 minutes a day, but it'd be over whatever specific situations it was that she was dealing with over the day whenever she would have negative thoughts. And by doing so, she actually gained a sense of objectivity. It helped her learn how to react more rationally. She gained more self-awareness, and this helped her feel better and also helped improve her social interactions with people. So Burns concluded, and I think rightfully so from his perspective, that this was a successful intervention. She made progress on her self-esteem issues. She also began to flourish more in social interactions. And as Christians, I think that we could say there's both positive and negative things that come out of this particular example that we see here. So the positive would be the application of practices that are consistent, that are in line with Christian theology. So even though David Burns didn't realize it, Gail was given a technique to help her learn to take control of her thoughts, which is a good thing. It gave her a tool to help her to pause and reflect and react and to think and to, just consider the types of reaction that she was having. And cognitive behavioral therapy has yielded many such techniques that, help people in the self-awareness department. Because, as I mentioned earlier, we shouldn't just sit back and let our thoughts go wherever they go. We should actively seek to capture them and control our way of thinking. The negative aspect just has to do with the subjectivity of what quantifies positive thoughts and negative thoughts. So what are positive thoughts? What are negative thoughts? With no guidance in these areas, people could draw very different conclusions as to what is a good thought and what is a bad thought. Because positive thoughts, according to CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, are essentially thoughts that could be considered helpful, and negative thoughts would be thoughts that could be considered unhelpful. And what is considered helpful or unhelpful may vary drastically depending on the person that you're dealing with. Okay, so there's inherent subjectivity there. So this type of therapy can help people feel better and improve their lives, but is very much a subjective practice based on my truth, not on God's biblical truth. So it may make people feel good, but it does not necessarily direct them towards what is actually good. And that would be the shortcoming. So essentially, this ideology stems from the idea that people can achieve good things in their lives by working very hard. The emphasis is put on faith in ourselves and our own abilities. And this, at its core, is very different from the Bible, which would say that God created us, God loves us, God gives us the grace and the strength and the resources we need to follow him and serve him in all circumstances. So the reliance becomes on me, what can I do to overcome these situations, as opposed to, God help me, I can't deal with these situations, please help me. Guide me, fill me with your spirit, point me in the direction I need to go. And this is the real issue. Even if a therapist manages to avoid inserting their own personal opinions and their worldview onto the situation, because there's no real guidance, the person and their thoughts can really go in any direction. It will tend to go in towards the self-serving direction, not towards the God-serving direction. That's just the inherent nature of this form of therapy. It's really relativistic and humanistic at its core, as opposed to being biblical. And in a sense, helps people to become more productive worshipers of themselves. And just like my coworker Sally, right, I'm sure the intention of these therapists is good. They have techniques, they have practices, they have all these things that they bring to the table to help people improve their lives. But that's really the extent of what they offer, right? They can help them improve their lives here on earth, help make them feel better, which is very different than helping people to aspire to do what is good. So because of this, I would say that any kind of counseling that is spiritual in nature, that deals with good and bad, that deals with worldviews, that deals with any kind of moral judgment that has to be made, should be dealt with by people who themselves are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, and are able to instruct, who are wise by God's standard, not by man's standard. And there's also a parallel here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul rebukes the Christians of the church of Corinth because they were having disputes with each other and they were going to secular court to resolve their issues. And he encouraged them rather to seek counsel within the church to find resolution to these issues. And I draw this parallel because it's in the same spirit that we should seek to solve internal disputes that exist within our own self through the wise counsel of those who also fear God and understand his word. So although a lot of helpful research and techniques have come from studies of psychology, we need to be discerning about the actual counseling aspect that we receive from psychotherapists. And just as a conclusion here, because I know I'm very analytical and I may sound cold and a little bit harsh, because there may be people here, there may be people that you know who have gone to psychotherapy, who are in psychotherapy, who have gained a lot from that kind of counseling, right? And I don't want to take away from that. Because I realize that, if you look at the context of the church, we don't obviously seem to have the resources to deal with whatever issue it is that you might be having. So it's easy for me to say, just look into the church and find a solution. Well, when you're in that kind of state of mind and you're looking at the church, it's not so obvious that you can even find the solution through that path. Because a lot of people have serious mental illness. It's very crippling. And they could barely even function in their daily lives, whether it's depression, which just oppresses people's spirits. It makes people feel hopeless. It makes people feel alone. It just makes it hard to even muster the energy to get out of the bed every morning. Or if people have anxiety issues, where they just live in constant fear because they overthink things that are only real in their own mind, but not real in reality. But no matter how much they try to rationalize it, they can't. They just feel helpless. And they're just scared and they're nervous and they can't properly function and they can't find any happiness in life because of these issues that they have. Many people have trauma. We live in a fallen world where many people have experienced or witnessed horrible things that are hard to overcome. And I don't want to imply that I'm somehow unsympathetic to these things. And a lot of times these people will resort to medication, resort to self-medicating with drugs and alcohol and all these other sorts of things just to help them, function through their day so that they can get through all the struggles that it is that they're going through in their life. And the list goes on, right? People are just suffering. People have mental illness, and mental illness is hard. Okay, so I'm not in any way saying you shouldn't go see a psychotherapist. In fact, there's a certain niceness of going to psychotherapy, right? Because it's anonymous. So if I have problems, if I have things that I'm ashamed about, I wouldn't want to go and talk to a person who I see every day or every week about the issues that I have. So there's obviously a certain comfort that comes from seeing a psychotherapist, as well as the fact that, they have an air of professionalism because they know the types of techniques that might help you gain kind of grasp of yourself and these situations that you're dealing with. So I get it. God gets it. But whatever your issue might be, okay, and everybody has issues all over the world, some people worse than others. I just want to talk to everybody today, whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, that there is no perfect counselor than Jesus Christ. All right, Jesus Christ is the most wonderful and perfect counselor you could ever contemplate. He's full of goodness. He's filled with knowledge. He's able to instruct. There's no better friend than Jesus Christ. No one has better interest for you than Jesus Christ himself. And as ashamed as you might be about yourself, about your thoughts, whatever that might be, Christ already knows all these things about you, and he still loves you, and he's still calling out to you all the time. And he also has all the answers you could possibly hope for, all the answers that you could possibly need in your walk in the world, in your walk with him, in your spiritual struggles. Whatever battles you're going through, just put them on Jesus. He could take anything you put on him. He took your sins on the cross. Whatever stresses or hardships you're going through, well, you can just hang on to Jesus because he's that rock in the storms. Whenever there's changes, whenever there's uncertainties in life, well, Christ is always there. Christ is always consistent. Christ will never change. You could always rely on Jesus Christ. No one can advise you like him. No one can comfort you like Jesus. And Jesus can do much more than make you feel better. He can make you born again. He won't just make your life better. He will give you life, and he gave his life for you. That's Jesus Christ. So just know that Jesus doesn't want you to think that he can't solve your problems. He doesn't want you to think that you need to go out into the world to find solutions to whatever problem it is that you have, because Christ wants you to come to him and pray to him and call to him, and he'll give you all the comfort that you could ever need. And I just want to close with this verse, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is comfortable and my burden is light. Christ is Lord, and just know that you guys could always lean on him, whatever struggles you may have. Dear Heavenly Father, we are so humbled by you, so humbled by your perfection, so humbled at how much you care for us, so humbled that all of these issues that we may have within ourselves, that you are aware of them, yet you still call out to us and you still love us. And we thank you for the example that we read in 1 Kings chapter 12, where Rehoboam received good counsel, and that counsel was to lighten the yoke and reduce the burdens. And we're just so thankful that you gave us a light yoke and have reduced our burdens as well, Lord, that we can just trust in you and put all of our faith in you and put all of our woes and our struggles and our hardships on you, and that you could take them for us. And we pray that you can help us to take control of our thoughts and direct them towards you, because that is the path that we need to follow in order to overcome all of these challenges and these mental illnesses and all these other things that we may have in our life. And we thank you that you're compassionate and that you provide us all the tools that we need through all the skilled workers that exist on the earth. And we just hope that we can come to accept that it is fundamentally you that we should be going to find resolution for any such spiritual issue. We thank you that you paid the cost of all of it on the cross and that you did so out of love for us. And we praise your holy, holy name.